Hi, I'm Jessica. When my parents ripped up what they thought was a $30 million check right in front of my face, I just smiled and said thank you. What they didn't know was that the real check was safely tucked away in my purse, and what they'd just destroyed was a photocopy I'd prepared for exactly this moment. But the story of how I got to that point, how my own family tried to steal my inheritance, and what I discovered about the fortune that was rightfully mine, will shock you to your core. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The law office of Morrison Associates smelled like old leather and fresh coffee when I walked in that Tuesday morning in downtown Phoenix. I had no idea I was about to discover that everything I thought I knew about my family was a carefully constructed lie. My grandmother, Eleanor Winters, had passed away 3 weeks earlier, and this was the formal reading of her will. I expected maybe a few $1,000s, perhaps some jewelry. What I got instead was a front row seat to the most elaborate betrayal I could have ever imagined. My name is Jessica Winters, and I'm 28 years old. I work as a marketing coordinator for a small tech company, living paycheck to paycheck in a cramped studio apartment on the outskirts of Scottsdale. My parents, Richard and Margaret Winters, had always painted themselves as middle-class folks who worked hard for everything they had. Dad managed a hardware store, Mom was a part-time bookkeeper. We weren't poor, but we certainly weren't wealthy. At least, that's what I'd been told my entire life. Growing up, I rarely saw my grandmother Eleanor. She lived in a modest house across town, and family visits were infrequent and awkward. My parents always seemed tense around her, cutting conversations short, and finding excuses to leave early. When I asked about her, they'd get this strange look in their eyes and change the subject. They told me she was eccentric, difficult, and that she disapproved of their lifestyle choices. I accepted this explanation because children accept what their parents tell them, even when something feels off. Eleanor had worked as a secretary for most of her life, or so I was told. She drove an old Honda, wore simple clothes, and lived in what appeared to be a basic ranch-style home in an average neighborhood. Nothing about her suggested wealth or hidden assets. When she died suddenly of a heart attack, I was sad but not devastated. We hadn't been close, and I felt guilty about that distance now that it was permanent. The morning of the will reading, I arrived at the law office 15 minutes early, wearing my best black dress and the only pair of heels I owned that weren't scuffed. The receptionist, a kind woman with silver hair, offered me coffee and directed me to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the busy street below. I sat there nervously, wondering who else would be joining us. I knew my parents would be there, obviously, but I wasn't sure if Eleanor had other relatives or friends who might be mentioned in her will. My parents arrived exactly on time, which was typical for them. Dad wore his one good suit, the navy one he'd had for at least 10 years. And Mom had on a conservative black dress with a pearl necklace I'd seen her wear to every funeral and formal event for as long as I could remember. They kissed me hello, but something felt different about their demeanor. There was an energy between them, a tension I couldn't quite identify. They kept exchanging glances, and Mom's hands were trembling slightly as she set her purse down on the polished conference table. "Nervous?" I asked, trying to make conversation. Dad cleared his throat. "Just want to get this over with, honey. You know how these things can be." But I didn't know how these things could be. I'd never been to a will reading before. I had no frame of reference for what was normal or abnormal in this situation. Mr. Morrison entered the room at exactly 10 o'clock. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a calm, professional manner that immediately put me at ease. He carried a thick manila folder and what appeared to be several sealed envelopes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Thank you all for coming," he said, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "I know this is a difficult time, and I'll try to make this process as straightforward as possible." He opened the folder and pulled out what looked like a lengthy legal document. Eleanor Winters was very specific about her wishes and how she wanted her estate handled. She also left personal letters for each of you, which I'll distribute after we go through the formal will. I glanced at my parents again. Mom was gripping Dad's hand so tightly her knuckles were white. This seemed like an extreme reaction to inheriting what I assumed would be a modest estate from a woman who lived such a simple life. Mr. Morrison began reading the formal language of the will, the standard legal jargon about sound mind and body, and the revocation of all previous wills. Then he got to the specific bequests, and my world shifted on its axis. To my son, Richard Winters, I leave the sum of $50,000. I saw Dad's jaw clench. $50,000 was a significant amount of money for our family, but his reaction seemed disappointed rather than grateful. To my daughter-in-law, Margaret Winters, I leave my jewelry collection and the sum of $25,000. Mom's breathing became shallow. Again, this seemed generous to me, but her response suggested she'd been expecting something different. Then Mr. Morrison paused, looking directly at me. To my beloved granddaughter, Jessica Marie Winters, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all real estate holdings, investment portfolios, business interests, and liquid assets. The current estimated value of this inheritance is approximately $32 million. The silence in the room was deafening. I felt like someone had just told me the earth was flat, or that gravity worked in reverse. $32 million? That was impossible. My grandmother lived in a modest house and drove an old car. She worked as a secretary. Where would $32 million come from? I stared at Mr. Morrison, waiting for him to laugh and tell me there had been some mistake. Instead, he reached into his folder and pulled out what looked like a cashier's check, sliding it across the table toward me. This check represents the liquid assets portion of your inheritance, Jessica. Approximately $30 million. The remaining assets will require some time to transfer, but this is yours immediately. My hands shook as I picked up the check. It was real. It had my name on it. $30 million written out in both numbers and words, drawn on the account of Eleanor Winters, with today's date. I stared at it until the numbers started to blur. That's when my parents exploded. "This is ridiculous!" Dad's voice was louder than I'd ever heard it. "There's been some kind of mistake. My mother didn't have this kind of money." Mom was on her feet, pacing behind her chair. She lived like a pauper her entire life. She pinched pennies and reused tea bags. Where would she get $30 million? Mr. Morrison remained calm, his hands folded on the table. "I understand this comes as a surprise, but I assure you there's no mistake. Eleanor Winters was a very wealthy woman who chose to live modestly. She made some extremely wise investments over the years, and she inherited a substantial sum from her own father, Jessica's great-grandfather, many decades ago." "That's impossible," Dad insisted. "She never mentioned any of this. She let us struggle financially while she was sitting on a fortune?" I was still staring at the check, my mind racing. "I don't understand any of this," I said quietly. "Why didn't anyone tell me? Why keep it a secret?" Mr. Morrison's expression grew serious. "Perhaps the personal letters will provide some clarity. Eleanor was very specific about wanting each of you to understand her reasoning." He handed out 3 sealed envelopes. Mine was thick, much thicker than my parents'. The outside simply said Jessica, in my grandmother's careful handwriting. I opened mine with trembling fingers while my parents tore into theirs. The letter was several pages long, written in the same precise script I remembered from birthday cards. "My dearest Jessica," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've just learned something that will change your life forever. I'm sorry for keeping this secret from you, but I had my reasons, which I hope will become clear as you read on." The letter went on to explain that my great-grandfather had been a successful businessman who'd built a small empire in mining and real estate in the early 1900s. He'd left everything to Eleanor, his only child, when he died in 1962. She'd been 25 years old and suddenly worth millions of dollars. "I made a decision early on to live modestly and never tell anyone about the money," the letter continued. "I'd seen what wealth did to families, how it changed people in relationships. I wanted to live a normal life and see who people really were when money wasn't part of the equation." She wrote about meeting my grandfather, how they'd fallen in love and married without him ever knowing about her inheritance. She'd continued working, continued living simply, and invested the money wisely over the decades. By the time my grandfather died 10 years ago, the estate had grown to over $40 million. "Your father knows nothing about this money," the letter explained. "I chose not to tell him because I wanted to see what kind of man he really was, what kind of father he would be without the influence of wealth. I'm afraid what I discovered disappointed me greatly. My heart started pounding as I read further. Eleanor described years of watching my father struggle financially, but every time she'd offered to help in small ways, he'd become angry and prideful, refusing assistance. She'd tried to have a relationship with me, but my parents had actively discouraged it, claiming she was too critical and difficult. The truth, Jessica, is that your parents kept you away from me because they were ashamed of their lifestyle. They wanted you to think we were all simple, middle-class people. They were afraid that if you got close to me, you might discover things about our family that they preferred to keep hidden. The letter went on to reveal something that made my blood run cold. My parents weren't actually struggling financially. Dad didn't just manage a hardware store. He owned 3 of them. Mom wasn't a part-time bookkeeper. She had her own accounting firm. They lived modestly by choice, but they had been lying to me about their true financial situation my entire life. They wanted you to grow up thinking money was scarce so you'd be grateful for everything they provided, Eleanor's letter explained. They wanted you to be dependent on them, to never question their authority or seek independence. I watched them manipulate you with guilt about money, watched them control your choices by claiming they couldn't afford to help you with college or your dreams. I remembered all the times I'd wanted to study abroad, to take internships that didn't pay well, to pursue opportunities that required financial support. My parents had always shaken their heads sadly and explained that they just couldn't afford to help. I'd felt guilty for even asking, ashamed of wanting things that were supposedly beyond our means. The final straw for me, the letter continued, was when you graduated from college and wanted to pursue your master's degree. You were accepted to Northwestern with a partial scholarship, but you needed help with living expenses. I offered to pay for everything, but your parents told you I was being manipulative and controlling. They convinced you to turn down the opportunity and take the first job you could find instead. I remembered that conversation. I'd been so excited about graduate school, but my parents had painted Eleanor's offer as some kind of trap. They'd said she was trying to buy my affection, and that accepting her money would put me in her debt forever. Believing them, I declined the offer and taken my current job instead. I realized then that your parents saw you as property rather than a person with your own dreams and potential, Eleanor wrote. They were more interested in keeping you under their control than in helping you flourish. That's when I decided that my money would go to you directly, with no interference from them. The letter concluded with instructions about accessing the inheritance and advice about being careful with whom I trusted. There was also a warning that surprised me. Jessica, I need you to be prepared for your parents' reaction to this news. They may try to convince you that you don't deserve this money, that you should share it with them or let them manage it for you. They may claim that I was mentally incompetent or that the will is invalid. Stand firm. This money is yours, and you have every right to it. Use it to build the life you've always dreamed of, the life they prevented you from pursuing. I finished reading and looked up to find my parents staring at me with expressions I'd never seen before. There was anger there, and something else. Something that looked like calculation. "What does your letter say?" Mom asked, her voice tight. I hesitated. The letter felt private, personal, but I also felt like I owed them some explanation. She explains about the money, about why she kept it secret. "And?" Dad prompted. "And she says it's mine to use however I choose." My parents exchanged a look that made my stomach churn. It was the same look I'd seen them share when I was a child, and had done something they needed to correct or control. "Jessica," Dad said carefully, "you have to understand that this is overwhelming for all of us. $30 million is a tremendous responsibility. You're young, you don't have experience managing this kind of wealth. What your father is saying," Mom added, "is that we should probably work together on this. Make sure the money is invested properly, used wisely." I clutched the check tighter. "What do you mean, work together?" "Well," Dad said, "your mother and I have been managing finances for decades. We understand budgets, investments, long-term planning. Maybe it would be best if we helped you set up some kind of trust or managed account." Something in their tone reminded me of every time they'd convinced me to give up an opportunity or change my plans. The same gentle but insistent pressure. The same implication that I wasn't capable of making good decisions on my own. I think I need some time to process all of this, I said, standing up from the table. Mr. Morrison nodded approvingly. That's very wise, Jessica. This is a significant change, and you should take whatever time you need to adjust. But my parents weren't ready to let it go. Honey, Mom said, before you leave, maybe we should at least put that check somewhere safe. That's an enormous amount of money to just carry around. I can deposit it in my bank account, I said. Your bank account? Dad laughed, but it didn't sound amused. Sweetheart, your little credit union isn't equipped to handle this kind of transaction. You need a proper bank, proper financial advisors. I know people, Mom added. I can make some calls, set up meetings with wealth management professionals. Again, that familiar pressure to let them take control, to let them handle things, because I was supposedly too inexperienced or naive to manage on my own. But something Eleanor had written in her letter echoed in my mind. Stand firm. I appreciate the concern, I said, but I think I can figure out how to handle my own money. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. My parents' expressions shifted subtly, and for the first time in my life, I saw them clearly. Not as loving, protective parents who only wanted what was best for me, but as people who were angry that their control over me was suddenly threatened. Jessica, Dad's voice carried a warning tone I recognized from childhood. You're being impulsive. This isn't the time for stubborn independence. This money should benefit the whole family, Mom added. After everything we've done for you, everything we've sacrificed, don't you think we deserve some consideration? I stared at them, really stared, and wondered how I'd never noticed the manipulation before. Every phrase was designed to make me feel guilty, to make me doubt my own judgment, to convince me that taking control of my inheritance was somehow selfish or wrong. That's when Mr. Morrison spoke up. If I may, he said gently, Eleanor was very specific about this inheritance belonging solely to Jessica. There are no conditions requiring her to share it or have it managed by anyone else. My parents turned to him with barely concealed hostility. She was an old woman, Dad said. She didn't understand the complexities of modern wealth management. On the contrary, Mr. Morrison replied, Eleanor was extremely sharp and very well informed about financial matters. She worked with top advisors for decades and was quite capable of making her own decisions about her estate. I could see my parents growing more agitated by the minute. The mask of concerned parental guidance was slipping, revealing something underneath that made me deeply uncomfortable. I think I'm going to go home and think about all of this, I announced, tucking the check carefully into my purse. Wait, Mom said quickly. Jessica, at least let us give you a ride home. We can talk more about this. But I didn't want to be trapped in a car with them right now. I needed space, needed time to process not just the inheritance but everything Eleanor's letter had revealed about my family dynamics. I drove myself, I said. I'll call you later. I shook hands with Mr. Morrison, thanked him for his time, and headed for the door. As I reached for the handle, I heard my father say something to my mother in a low voice that I wasn't supposed to hear. Don't worry, she'll come around. She always does. Those words followed me out of the building and into the bright Arizona sunshine. As I sat in my car in the parking lot, still clutching the check that represented more money than I'd ever imagined having, I realized that my grandmother's final gift wasn't just financial security. It was the truth about my family and the freedom to finally see them clearly. But I had no idea that the real battle was just beginning, or that my parents had already started planning their next move to get control of what they believed should rightfully be theirs. The drive home from the law office felt surreal, like I was floating through someone else's life. I kept glancing at my purse on the passenger seat, knowing that inside was a piece of paper worth $30 million. Every red light made me paranoid that someone might somehow know what I was carrying. When I finally pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex, I sat in the car for several minutes, just breathing and trying to process what had happened. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. Honey, we're worried about you. Can we come over and talk? I stared at the message, remembering my father's words in the lawyer's office. She'll come around. She always does. The confidence in his voice, the certainty that they could manipulate me into giving them what they wanted, made my skin crawl. I turned off my phone without responding. Inside my tiny studio apartment, I spread Eleanor's letter out on my kitchen table and read it again, this time paying attention to details I'd missed in my initial shock. She mentioned specific instances of my parents' deception, things I'd never questioned before. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how many small lies had shaped my understanding of our family's financial situation. I remembered being 12 years old and desperately wanting to take violin lessons. My best friend Sarah had started playing, and I was enchanted by the music she could create. When I asked my parents, they'd given me that familiar sad smile and explained that violin lessons were expensive, that we needed to save money for more important things. I'd felt guilty for even asking, ashamed of wanting something we supposedly couldn't afford. But now I was thinking about other things from that same time period. We'd taken a family vacation to Hawaii that summer. Dad had bought a new truck. Mom had redecorated the entire living room. Somehow there had been money for all of those things, but not for $30 violin lessons for their daughter. The pattern became clearer as I thought back through my childhood and teenage years. Every time I'd wanted something that might lead to independence or personal growth, money was always too tight. But money appeared readily when my parents wanted something for themselves or when it helped keep me dependent on them. I pulled out my laptop and started researching. If Eleanor was right about my parents owning multiple businesses rather than just working regular jobs, there should be public records somewhere. I started with business registrations in Arizona, searching for my father's name. What I found made my stomach drop. Richard Winters wasn't just the manager of a hardware store. He was listed as the owner of 3 hardware stores in the Phoenix metro area, plus a landscaping supply company and a small construction firm. The business registrations went back 15 years. All this time, while I'd been struggling to pay my student loans and living in a cramped apartment, my father had been running a mini business empire. I searched for my mother's name next. Margaret Winters was listed as the owner of Winters Accounting Services, a firm that had been operating for 12 years with 15 employees. According to the state business database, her company had contracts with dozens of local businesses and reported annual revenues in the mid-6 figures. My hands were shaking as I stared at the screen. My parents weren't just middle-class people getting by on modest salaries. They were successful business owners who had been lying to me about their financial situation my entire life. Every guilt trip about money, every time they'd made me feel selfish for wanting things we supposedly couldn't afford, had been pure manipulation. I needed more information. I needed to understand the scope of their deception and figure out why they'd gone to such elaborate lengths to hide their success from me. I thought about Eleanor's letter, about her observation that my parents saw me as property rather than a person with my own dreams. The more I learned, the more that assessment seemed accurate. My phone rang, startling me out of my research. It was Dad. I hesitated, then answered, curious to hear what approach they'd take next. "Jessica, honey, your mother and I have been thinking about everything that happened today. We know you must be overwhelmed." His voice was warm and concerned, the same tone he'd used throughout my childhood when he wanted to convince me of something. Now that I was listening for it, I could hear the underlying manipulation. "I'm okay, Dad. Just processing." Of course. Of course. Listen, we've made some calls to financial advisors, people who specialize in large inheritances. We could set up some meetings for tomorrow, just to help you understand your options. I haven't decided what I want to do yet. There was a pause, and I could almost hear him recalibrating his approach. Well, the most important thing right now is making sure that money is secure. You can't just leave a $30 million check sitting around. Why don't you let us help you get it deposited somewhere safe? I can handle it myself, Dad. Jessica. His tone sharpened slightly. You're being naive about this. This isn't like depositing a paycheck. There are protocols, procedures, tax implications you don't understand. I thought about the business registrations I'd just found, about the years of financial success he'd hidden from me while lecturing me about fiscal responsibility. How do you know so much about large financial transactions, Dad? I thought you just managed a hardware store. Another pause, longer this time. I've learned things over the years, picked up knowledge from customers who are business owners. Look, the point is that we want to help you make smart decisions. What if I don't want your help? The silence stretched uncomfortably. When he spoke again, his voice was colder. Jessica, I think the shock of this inheritance is affecting your judgment. You're talking like we're strangers instead of your parents who love you and want what's best for you. There it was again, the guilt trip designed to make me doubt my own perceptions. But this time, instead of working, it just made me angry. I need some time to think, Dad. I'll call you when I'm ready to talk. Wait, don't hang up. Your mother wants to speak to you. Before I could object, Mom's voice came through the phone, tight with barely controlled emotion. Jessica, I don't understand what's happening here. We're your family. We've always been here for you, always supported you, and now you're acting like we're the enemy. I'm not acting like anything, Mom. I just need space to process this. Process what? The fact that your grandmother left you money? We're happy for you, sweetheart. All we want is to make sure you handle it responsibly. How do you define responsibly? Well, obviously you'll want to invest most of it, set up trust funds, maybe buy a house. These are big decisions that require careful planning. What if I want to use some of it to travel, or go back to school, or start my own business? The sharp intake of breath was audible. Jessica, those kinds of impulsive decisions are exactly what we're worried about. You can't just throw money away on frivolous dreams. Frivolous dreams. The phrase hit me like a slap. How many times had they used those exact words to dismiss my aspirations? Graduate school was a frivolous dream. Studying abroad was a frivolous dream. Taking an unpaid internship at a nonprofit I cared about was a frivolous dream. Anything that might lead me away from their control was automatically labeled frivolous. I have to go, Mom. Jessica, please don't shut us out. We're trying to protect you. I hung up and immediately turned my phone off again. I needed to think clearly, without the constant pressure of their calls and texts. I needed to understand what I was really dealing with. I spent the next several hours researching everything I could find about my parents' businesses. What I discovered painted a picture of two people who were far more successful and financially sophisticated than they'd ever let me believe. Richard's construction company had worked on several major commercial projects. Margaret's accounting firm had grown steadily over the years, and now occupied an entire floor of a downtown office building. I found photos from business awards ceremonies, articles in trade publications, even a feature story in the local business journal about Mom's company being named one of the fastest-growing small businesses in Arizona. In every photo, my parents looked confident, professional, successful, nothing like the financially struggling middle-class couple they'd pretended to be at home. The more I learned, the angrier I became. Not just about the money, though that was certainly part of it. I was angry about all the opportunities I'd missed because I believed we couldn't afford them. I was angry about the guilt I'd carried for wanting things that were supposedly beyond our means. Most of all, I was angry about the fundamental dishonesty that had shaped our entire relationship. I thought about calling Eleanor's lawyer, Mr. Morrison, to ask if there were any other documents or information she'd left for me. But it was already past business hours, and I wasn't sure what questions to ask yet. I needed more time to piece together the full scope of what had been hidden from me. That's when I remembered something else from Eleanor's letter. She'd mentioned trying to help financially over the years, only to have my parents refuse and claim she was being manipulative. I wondered if there were specific instances she was referring to, times when her help could have made a real difference in my life. I called my bank to check my account balance, something I did obsessively because money was always tight. As I navigated through the automated system, I thought about how different my life could have been if I'd known the truth about my family's finances. I could have taken that internship at the environmental law firm instead of working retail through college. I could have studied abroad in London like I'd dreamed of doing. I could have pursued graduate school at Northwestern instead of settling for the first job I could find. Every choice I'd made had been constrained by what I believed about our financial limitations. And all of it had been based on lies. My phone buzzed with another text, this one from Mom. "We're coming over. We need to talk about this properly." Panic shot through me. I wasn't ready to face them again, especially not in my tiny apartment where I'd feel trapped. I grabbed my purse, made sure the check was secure inside, and headed for the door. I needed to be somewhere public, somewhere I could think clearly without their pressure and manipulation. I drove to a coffee shop in Old Town Scottsdale, one I'd never been to before. I wanted to be somewhere my parents wouldn't think to look for me, at least not immediately. I ordered a large coffee and found a corner table where I could sit with my back to the wall and watch the door. As I sat there, sipping my coffee and trying to organize my thoughts, I noticed a woman at the next table having what sounded like a difficult phone conversation. She was probably in her 40s, well-dressed, with the kind of confident demeanor that suggested professional success. "No, Mother, I'm not changing my mind," she was saying. "The money is mine, and I'm going to use it the way I see fit." I couldn't help but listen as she continued. "You had 30 years to support my decisions, and you chose not to. You don't get to suddenly become involved now that there's an inheritance involved." The parallels to my own situation were eerie. When she hung up, she noticed me watching and gave me a rueful smile. "Family drama," she said with a shrug. "My grandmother left me some money, and suddenly everyone has opinions about what I should do with it." "I can relate to that," I said, then found myself telling her about my day. There was something liberating about talking to a stranger, someone who had no investment in my family dynamics and could listen objectively. $30 million? She whistled softly. "That's life-changing money. What do you want to do with it?" It was the first time anyone had asked me what I wanted instead of telling me what I should do. "I don't know yet. I'm still trying to process the fact that my parents have been lying to me about money my entire life." "That's tough. But you know what? This inheritance gives you power now. The power to make your own choices without having to consider their opinions or approval." She was right. For the first time in my adult life, I had genuine independence. I didn't need my parents' financial support or guidance. I didn't need to factor their expectations into my decisions. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. "How did you handle it?" I asked. "The family pressure, I mean." "I set boundaries," she said firmly. "I made it clear that the money was mine to manage, and that their involvement was contingent on treating me with respect. Some of them adjusted their behavior. Others didn't, and I had to limit contact with them." That seems so drastic. Is it, though? If people only want to be in your life because of what you can give them, are they really people you want around? Her words stayed with me long after she left. I sat in that coffee shop until it closed at 9, thinking about boundaries and respect, and what I actually wanted my life to look like. When I finally drove home, I felt clearer and more determined than I had all day. My parents' car was in the parking lot of my apartment complex. They were sitting in it, waiting for me to return. The sight of them there, planning to ambush me in my own home, crystallized something that had been forming in my mind all day. They weren't acting like loving parents who were concerned about my well-being. They were acting like predators who saw an opportunity and weren't going to give up until they got what they wanted. I parked several spaces away and approached their car. Dad rolled down the window as I got close. "There you are. We've been worried sick. Where were you?" "Out," I said simply. "Jessica, we need to talk about this inheritance situation. You can't just run away every time we try to have a conversation." "I'm not running away. I'm taking time to think." Mom leaned across Dad to look at me. "Honey, we understand you're overwhelmed, but hiding from us isn't the solution. We're your family. We love you. If you love me, you'll give me the space I've asked for." "Space to do what?" Dad's voice was getting sharper. "Space to make impulsive decisions with money you don't understand? Space to figure out what I want without constant pressure from people who have been lying to me." The mask slipped completely then. Dad's expression hardened, and I saw the anger that had been simmering beneath his concerned parent act all day. "Lying to you?" "Jessica, everything we've ever done has been to protect you and help you grow into a responsible adult." "Really? Like when you convinced me to turn down graduate school because we supposedly couldn't afford it? While you were running multiple successful businesses?" The silence in the car was deafening. I watched my parents exchange that look again, the one that said they were recalculating their strategy. "How did you find out about that?" Mom asked quietly. "Does it matter? The point is that you've been manipulating me with fake financial limitations while building your own wealth in secret." "That's not what we were doing," Dad said. But his voice lacked conviction. "Then what were you doing? Help me understand why you lied to me for decades about something so fundamental." Another long pause. Finally, Mom spoke. "We wanted you to understand the value of money, to not take things for granted. By lying to me? By teaching you to be responsible and self-sufficient. Self-sufficient? I almost laughed. You made me dependent on your approval for every decision by convincing me I couldn't afford independence. I could see them both getting frustrated with my resistance to their explanations. This wasn't going according to whatever plan they'd hatched while waiting for me to come home. Jessica, Dad said carefully, I think Eleanor's letter has poisoned your mind against us. You have to remember that she was a bitter old woman who resented our success. What success? I thought you were just getting by on modest salaries. You know what I mean. Actually, I don't. Nothing you've told me today has been consistent with anything you've told me before. I could see Dad's jaw clenching, a sure sign that his patience was wearing thin. Get in the car, Jessica. We're going to go somewhere and sort this out properly. I'm not getting in the car. Yes, you are. This conversation is too important to have in a parking lot. There was something in his tone that reminded me of being a child, of the absolute authority he'd wielded over my life for so many years. But I wasn't a child anymore, and I had 30 million reasons to resist his control. No, Dad. I'm going inside now. When I'm ready to talk, I'll call you. I turned and walked toward my apartment building, my heart pounding but my steps steady. Behind me, I heard Dad get out of the car. Jessica, you get back here right now. I kept walking. I heard Mom saying something to him, trying to calm him down, but I didn't turn around. I made it to my apartment, locked the door behind me, and finally allowed myself to exhale. My phone immediately started ringing. I turned it off without looking at the caller ID. I needed a plan. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with and figure out how to protect myself and my inheritance from people who clearly felt entitled to it. But most importantly, I needed to decide what kind of life I wanted to build with this unexpected freedom. As I sat in my small apartment, holding the check that represented more money than I'd ever imagined having, I realized that Eleanor's greatest gift wasn't the inheritance itself. It was the truth about my family and the opportunity to finally break free from a lifetime of manipulation and control. But I was beginning to understand that they weren't going to make it easy for me. I woke up the next morning to the sound of someone pounding on my apartment door. The clock on my nightstand read 6:30 a.m., and my stomach dropped as I realized my parents had escalated their approach. The pounding was persistent, aggressive, nothing like their usual polite knocking. Jessica, open this door right now, Dad's voice carried through the thin walls. We know you're in there. I lay still, hoping they'd give up and leave, but the pounding continued. Other tenants were probably being woken up by the noise, and I felt embarrassed about the disturbance my family drama was causing. After 5 more minutes of relentless knocking, I got up and approached the door. I'm not opening the door, Dad. It's 6:30 in the morning. We need to talk, and you've been avoiding us. This is ridiculous, Jessica. Come back at a reasonable hour and maybe we can talk. We're talking now. Your mother barely slept last night because she's so worried about you. I heard Mom's voice then, higher pitched than usual. Jessica, please, honey. We just want to help you. We're scared you're going to make a terrible mistake. Their persistence was beginning to feel less like parental concern and more like harassment. I realized they weren't going to leave until they got what they wanted, which seemed to be access to me and my inheritance check. I'm calling the police if you don't leave, I said through the door. The police? Dad's voice was incredulous. We're your parents, for God's sake. You're going to call the police on your own family? You're disturbing my neighbors and refusing to leave when I've asked you to. That's harassment. There was a moment of silence. Then I heard them talking to each other in low, urgent voices. Finally, Dad spoke again, his tone completely different. Jessica, we're sorry. You're right, this isn't the time or place. But we really do need to have a serious conversation about this inheritance. There are things you don't understand, legal complications that could affect you. What kind of legal complications? Eleanor's will might be contested. There are other relatives who could challenge it, and if that happens, you could lose everything. We need to help you protect your interests. This was news to me. Mr. Morrison hadn't mentioned any potential challenges to the will, and Eleanor's letter hadn't suggested there might be other claimants to her estate. Either my parents knew something I didn't, or they were making things up to frighten me into accepting their help. What other relatives? I asked. Eleanor had a sister who died years ago, but she had children. Your grandmother's nieces and nephews. They could claim they have a right to part of the estate. I thought about this. It was possible, I supposed, though Eleanor had seemed very certain about her wishes, and Mr. Morrison had appeared confident about the validity of the will. If that's true, then Mr. Morrison would have mentioned it yesterday. Not necessarily. Lawyers don't always anticipate every possible challenge. That's why you need experienced people helping you navigate this. Like you? Like us, yes. We've been dealing with business and financial matters for years. We know how these things work. I almost laughed at the irony. They were finally admitting to their business experience, but only as a way to convince me I needed their help with my inheritance. I'll call Mr. Morrison later and ask him about potential challenges to the will. Jessica, by the time lawyers start getting involved in disputes, it's often too late to protect your interests properly. You need to be proactive. Their argument was starting to sound rehearsed, like they'd spent the evening crafting talking points designed to scare me into compliance. I was getting tired of standing by my door having this conversation through the walls. I'm not discussing this anymore right now. Please leave. Fine, Dad said, his voice tight with frustration. But Jessica, you need to understand something. This inheritance isn't just about you. It affects the whole family. Eleanor may have been angry with us, but that doesn't mean she had the right to cut us out completely. There it was, the real issue. They felt entitled to part of Eleanor's money, and they were angry that she'd left it all to me instead of dividing it among the family. Eleanor had every right to leave her money to whoever she wanted. Did she, though? She was elderly, possibly not thinking clearly. She was influenced by decades of resentment and bitterness. Are you planning to contest the will? The silence that followed was answer enough. They were at least considering it, which meant they were already thinking of me as an opponent rather than a daughter they wanted to help. We're trying to avoid having to do that, Mom said finally. If we can work together, if you're willing to be reasonable about sharing this windfall, then we can keep this within the family. And if I'm not willing to share, then we'll have to explore our legal options. The threat was clear. Either I gave them what they wanted voluntarily, or they would try to take it through the courts. The loving, concerned parents act was completely gone now, replaced by naked greed and entitlement. I think you should leave now, I said firmly. Jessica, don't make this harder than it needs to be. I'm not making anything hard. You're the ones making threats and demands. I heard them moving away from the door, talking to each other again in those low, urgent voices. A few minutes later, I heard their car start and drive away. I waited another 10 minutes before I felt safe enough to look out the window and confirm they were really gone. My hands were shaking as I made coffee and tried to process what had just happened. My parents weren't just disappointed about not inheriting money themselves. They were actively planning to fight me for it, using legal challenges and emotional manipulation to get what they felt they deserved. I needed help, but I wasn't sure who to trust. I could call Mr. Morrison, but he was Eleanor's lawyer, not mine. I probably needed my own legal representation, someone who could advise me about protecting my inheritance and dealing with family members who might try to contest the will. I spent the morning researching estate attorneys in Phoenix, looking for someone with experience in inheritance disputes. I found several firms that specialized in probate litigation and made a list of lawyers to contact. But first, I wanted to understand more about the specific threats my parents had mentioned. I called Mr. Morrison's office as soon as they opened at 9 a.m. His secretary put me through immediately, and I could hear the concern in his voice when I explained what had happened that morning. I'm sorry to hear your parents are taking this approach, he said. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon for family members to feel entitled to inheritances, even when the deceased's wishes are clearly stated. They mentioned Eleanor's nieces and nephews might contest the will. Is that a real possibility? Eleanor did have a sister who predeceased her, and that sister had 3 children. However, they've had no contact with Eleanor in over 20 years, and they have no legal standing to contest a will that clearly expresses her wishes. So my parents were lying about that threat? Not necessarily lying, but certainly exaggerating the risk. Any will can be contested, but that doesn't mean the challenge will be successful. Eleanor was of sound mind when she made her will. She had proper legal representation, and her intentions were very clear. What about my parents? Do they have any legal right to challenge it? Mr. Morrison paused. Children of the deceased do have standing to contest a will, but they would need to prove either that Eleanor was not mentally competent when she made it, or that she was unduly influenced by someone. Given that she worked with our firm for over 15 years and regularly updated her estate planning documents, proving incompetence would be very difficult. And undue influence? They would have to show that someone coerced her into changing her will against her true wishes. Since you had minimal contact with Eleanor in recent years, that would also be a difficult case to make. I felt some relief, but not complete reassurance. Even if my parents couldn't win a legal challenge, they could still tie up the inheritance in court for months or years, making my life miserable and costing a fortune in legal fees. What should I do to protect myself? I'd recommend you retain your own counsel, someone who specializes in estate litigation. I can provide you with some referrals. I'd also suggest you consider having the inheritance funds transferred to a secure account as soon as possible, so they're protected while any potential disputes are resolved. Is there any rush on that? I mean, how quickly do I need to act? The sooner the better. Once funds are properly secured and documented, they become much harder for challengers to tie up in court proceedings. After we hung up, I sat staring at the check that was still in my purse. $30 million was an abstract concept until you were holding the actual piece of paper that represented it. I needed to deposit it somewhere safe, but the process felt overwhelming and intimidating. I decided to start with my own bank, even though Dad had dismissed my credit union as inadequate for this kind of transaction. I called their main office and explained my situation to a manager, who transferred me to their wealth management department. $30 million? The wealth manager, a woman named Carol, sounded impressed. That's certainly a significant inheritance. We can absolutely help you with that deposit, but I'd recommend we set up a private banking relationship for you first. She explained that accounts of this size required special handling, additional security measures, and usually came with dedicated financial advisors. She offered to meet with me that afternoon to begin the process. Is there any urgency on getting this deposited? I asked. Well, cashier's checks don't expire, but I wouldn't recommend carrying something that valuable around indefinitely. The sooner we can get it into a secure account, the better. We scheduled a meeting for 2 p.m. I spent the rest of the morning researching the estate attorneys Mr. Morrison had recommended, finally settling on a woman named Patricia Hernandez who had excellent reviews and extensive experience in inheritance disputes. When I called her office, her assistant explained that Ms. Hernandez was in court but could see me the following morning. I made an appointment and felt slightly better about having professional help lined up. At exactly 1 p.m., my phone rang. It was Mom, and her voice was different again, warmer and more apologetic than it had been that morning. Jessica, honey, I'm calling to apologize for this morning. Your father and I were stressed and worried, and we handled things badly. Okay, I said cautiously. We've been thinking about everything, and we realize we've been putting too much pressure on you. This is your inheritance, and you have every right to make your own decisions about it. The sudden change in tone made me suspicious. A few hours ago, they'd been threatening legal action. Now they were backing down completely. I appreciate that, Mom. We were wondering if you'd like to have dinner tonight. Nothing heavy, no talk about money or inheritance. Just family time. We could go to that Italian place you like. I almost said yes automatically, the way I always had throughout my life when they suggested family activities. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the memory of their threats that morning, or maybe it was the pattern I was starting to recognize in their behavior. I don't think I'm ready for that yet. Oh, she sounded genuinely hurt. Well, when do you think you might be ready? I don't know, Mom. I need more time to process everything. Process what, exactly? The inheritance? Or Eleanor's letter? Or something else? All of it. The money, the lies about your businesses, the manipulation, the threats this morning. Everything. Jessica, I think you're being influenced by Eleanor's letter. She was a bitter woman who tried to turn you against us even after death. And there it was again. Anytime I questioned their behavior or expressed independence, it was because I was being influenced by someone else. I was never capable of thinking for myself or reaching my own conclusions. I have to go, Mom. I have an appointment. What kind of appointment? A personal one. Jessica, please don't shut us out. We're your family. We love you more than anyone else ever will. If that's true, then you'll respect my need for space. How much space? How long do you expect us to wait while you process? The question revealed the impatience behind her apologetic tone. They were willing to give me a little time, but not much, and definitely not as much as I actually needed. I don't have a timeline, Mom. This is a big adjustment for me. But you're still our daughter, right? You're not going to let money change who you are, or how you feel about your family? Money doesn't change who people are. It reveals who they already were. The silence that followed was long and uncomfortable. Finally, Mom spoke again, her voice cooler. I hope you'll remember everything we've done for you over the years, Jessica, all the love and support and sacrifice. I hope Eleanor's poison doesn't make you forget what really matters. After she hung up, I sat thinking about her words. What had they really sacrificed? They'd hidden their financial success, while making me feel guilty about any aspirations that cost money. They'd convinced me to give up opportunities, while building their own wealth in secret. They'd manipulated me into staying dependent on them while presenting themselves as loving, supportive parents. Maybe they did love me, in their own way, but it was a possessive, controlling kind of love that required me to remain small and dependent for them to feel comfortable expressing it. The meeting with Carol at the bank went smoothly. She was professional and helpful, explaining the various options for securing and investing large sums of money. By 4 p.m., the $30 million check was safely deposited in a new private banking account with multiple security features and my name as the sole account holder. Is there anything else you need help with today? Carol asked as we finished the paperwork. Actually, yes. If someone were to try to legally challenge my right to this money, would the bank freeze the account? Not without a court order, and even then, only if there were strong evidence of fraud or legal issues with the source of the funds. A simple will contest wouldn't be enough to freeze an account, especially when the inheritance was properly documented through probate. That was reassuring. Whatever legal games my parents might try to play, they couldn't immediately cut off my access to the money. As I drove home from the bank, I felt a strange sense of finality. The check was deposited, the money was secure, and I had taken the first real step toward independence from my parents' control. For the first time in my life, I had the financial freedom to make choices based on what I wanted rather than what they approved of or claimed we could afford. But I also knew this was just the beginning. My parents had made it clear they weren't going to give up easily, and I needed to be prepared for whatever they might try next. The loving family facade was cracking, and I was starting to see what lay underneath. As I pulled into my apartment complex, I noticed a familiar car in the parking lot. Not my parents' car, but one I recognized from somewhere. It took me a moment to remember where I'd seen it before, and when I did, my blood ran cold. It was Mr. Morrison's car, parked outside my building. Either he had come to see me about something urgent, or someone else had asked him to come. Given the timing and everything that had happened that day, I had a sinking feeling it wasn't a social visit. Mr. Morrison was standing beside his car when I pulled into the parking space, and his expression was grave. This wasn't the calm, professional demeanor I'd seen at his office yesterday. Something had clearly happened that required an urgent face-to-face conversation. Jessica, I'm glad I caught you. We need to talk. Is everything okay? How did you know where I live? Your address was in Eleanor's files. I'm sorry to ambush you like this, but I received some disturbing information this afternoon that I felt you should know about immediately. My stomach clenched. What kind of information? Is there somewhere private we can talk? This isn't a conversation for a parking lot. I hesitated. I barely knew this man, and after the morning's confrontation with my parents, I was feeling paranoid about trusting anyone. But he was Eleanor's lawyer, and he'd been nothing but professional and helpful so far. We can go to my apartment." Once inside, Mr. Morrison declined my offer of coffee and got straight to the point. "I received a call this afternoon from another attorney here in Phoenix, a man named Douglas Kemp. He's been retained by your parents to explore their legal options regarding Eleanor's will. They actually hired a lawyer already? It's only been 2 days since the reading. That's what concerns me." Mr. Kemp was very aggressive in his questioning, asking about Eleanor's mental state in her final years, whether she'd been taking any medications that might affect her judgment, whether she'd been isolated from family members who might have influenced her decisions. "But you said yesterday that Eleanor was completely competent when she made the will." "She was, but Mr. Kemp seems to be building a case for undue influence. He's specifically interested in your relationship with Eleanor, how often you saw her, whether you might have pressured her into leaving you the inheritance." I sat down heavily on my couch. "That's ridiculous. I barely saw her at all. My parents kept us apart, remember?" "I know that, and I told Mr. Kemp exactly that. But he seemed to have information suggesting otherwise. He claimed to have witnesses who could testify that you'd been visiting Eleanor regularly in recent months, that you'd been discussing her will and encouraging her to cut your parents out of the inheritance." "That's a complete lie. I haven't seen Eleanor in over a year, and before that it was probably 6 months. My parents always made excuses for why we couldn't visit her." Mr. Morrison nodded grimly. "I believe you, but the fact that they're making these claims suggests they're prepared to go to court with perjured testimony. That's a serious escalation. Can they do that? Just lie in court? People commit perjury all the time, unfortunately. The question is whether they can find witnesses willing to support their version of events, and whether a judge will find their story credible." I thought about the lengths my parents had already gone to in order to control my life and hide their own financial success, manufacturing false witnesses didn't seem beyond them, especially if $30 million was at stake. "What else did this lawyer say?" He also asked about Eleanor's medical records, specifically whether she'd been diagnosed with any form of dementia or cognitive decline. He wants to subpoena her medical files and interview her doctors. Was there anything wrong with her mentally? Not that I'm aware of. Eleanor was sharp as a tack every time I met with her, which was regularly over the past 15 years. But medical records can be interpreted different ways, especially by experts who are paid to find problems. The scope of what my parents were apparently planning was starting to sink in. This wasn't just a simple challenge to the will. They were preparing to paint Eleanor as mentally incompetent, and me as a manipulative gold digger who took advantage of a vulnerable elderly woman. How long could a court case like this drag on? Months, possibly years. And even if we ultimately win, the legal fees could be substantial. Not to mention the emotional toll of having your character assassinated in court by your own parents. I felt sick. 24 hours ago, I thought the biggest challenge would be figuring out how to manage a large inheritance responsibly. Now I was facing the possibility of a long, expensive legal battle against my own family. "There's something else," Mr. Morrison continued. Mr. Kemp asked very specific questions about the timing of Eleanor's decision to change her will. He seemed to know that she'd modified it recently, within the past 6 months. How recently? She made the final version just 3 months ago. The previous version left the bulk of her estate to charity, with smaller amounts to family members, including your parents. This was news to me. So originally, my parents would have inherited something? About $500,000 each. Not insignificant, but nowhere near what you've inherited. What made her change it? Mr. Morrison pulled out a file folder from his briefcase. She came to see me after learning about your parents' reaction to her offer to pay for your graduate school. She was deeply upset about how they'd manipulated you into turning down the opportunity. He handed me a document from the file. It was a letter Eleanor had written to Mr. Morrison, dated 4 months ago, explaining her decision to revise her will. The final straw, I read aloud, was discovering that Richard and Margaret have been systematically lying to Jessica about their own financial situation, while preventing her from accepting help that could improve her life. They have shown themselves to be manipulative and controlling, more interested in maintaining power over Jessica than in supporting her happiness and growth. The letter went on to detail specific instances where my parents had interfered with Eleanor's attempts to help me, including the graduate school situation and several other occasions when she'd offered financial assistance that I'd never even heard about. She tried to help me other times. According to this letter, she offered to pay for study abroad programs, internships, even to help with a down payment on a house. Your parents told her each time that you weren't interested, that you preferred to make your own way in the world. I felt a surge of rage so intense it made my hands shake. They hadn't just hidden their own success from me, they'd actively prevented me from receiving help that could have changed my life. How many opportunities had I missed because they'd intercepted Eleanor's offers and lied about my supposed lack of interest? There's more, Mr. Morrison said gently. Eleanor hired a private investigator to look into your parents' finances. She suspected they weren't being truthful about their situation, and she wanted proof before making her final decision about the will. He handed me another document, this one a report from a private investigation firm. It detailed my parents' business holdings, their income, their assets, and their spending patterns. The numbers were staggering. Combined, their businesses generated over $2 million annually in income. They owned property in 3 states, had investment portfolios worth millions, and maintained multiple bank accounts with substantial balances. They're millionaires, I said, staring at the numbers. Multi-millionaires. They've been wealthy for over a decade, but they've gone to extraordinary lengths to hide it from you. The report also included photographs of my parents at various business and social events, dressed in expensive clothing and jewelry I'd never seen them wear. There were pictures of them at charity galas, business award ceremonies, and upscale social gatherings. They looked comfortable and confident in these settings, nothing like the modest middle-class couple they pretended to be at home. Why would they hide this from me? What did they gain by making me think we were struggling financially? Control, Mr. Morrison said simply. As long as you believed they couldn't afford to help you pursue your dreams, you remained dependent on their approval and support. You made life choices based on their supposed limitations rather than your own desires. And now that I have my own money, that control is threatened. Exactly. Which is why they're willing to go to such lengths to contest the will. This isn't just about the inheritance money. It's about maintaining power over your life. I thought about the pattern of my parents' behavior over the past 2 days. The initial shock and disappointment, followed by attempts at manipulation, then threats, then a brief period of false conciliation, and now apparently perjured testimony and legal challenges. Each escalation had come when their previous tactics failed to achieve the desired result. What do you think I should do? Fight back. Eleanor anticipated this possibility, which is why she documented everything so thoroughly. She left detailed records of her mental state, her reasoning for the will changes, and evidence of your parents' deception. She wanted to make sure you'd have the tools to defend yourself if they tried to contest her wishes. But you said this could drag on for years. It could. But Eleanor also left you with substantial resources to fight it. She specifically set aside funds for legal fees in case the will was challenged. She planned for this? She planned for everything. Eleanor was a very thorough woman who understood exactly what kind of people your parents were and what they were capable of doing. Mr. Morrison gathered his papers and prepared to leave. I'll send Mr. Kemp a formal response to his inquiries, making it clear that any challenge to this will is groundless, and that we have extensive documentation to support Eleanor's competence and intentions. But you should definitely retain your own counsel as soon as possible. I have an appointment tomorrow morning with Patricia Hernandez. Excellent choice. Patricia has handled several high-profile inheritance disputes, and she doesn't back down from aggressive opposing counsel. After Mr. Morrison left, I sat in my apartment trying to process everything I'd learned. The private investigator's report painted a picture of my parents that was so different from what I'd believed that it felt like I was learning about strangers. These weren't people who'd struggled to provide for their family while living modestly and responsibly. These were wealthy individuals who'd constructed an elaborate deception to manipulate their own daughter. I started thinking about specific memories from my childhood and young adulthood, re-examining them through this new lens. The family vacation to Hawaii that coincided with my being told we couldn't afford violin lessons. The new truck Dad bought the same month he claimed we couldn't afford to help with my college textbooks. The living room renovation that happened while I was working 2 part-time jobs to pay for basic necessities. Every instance of their supposed financial limitation had been accompanied by evidence of their actual wealth, but I'd never connected the dots because I'd trusted them completely. Children believe what their parents tell them, and I'd never had reason to question their version of our family's financial reality. My phone rang, interrupting my brooding. It was an unknown number, but given everything that was happening, I decided to answer. Jessica? This is Douglas Kemp. I represent your parents in the matter of Eleanor Winters' estate. The voice was smooth and professional, but there was an underlying aggression that put me immediately on guard. I didn't give you permission to call me. You should be communicating through my attorney. You don't have an attorney yet, according to my information. I'm calling to see if we can resolve this matter without unnecessary litigation. There's nothing to resolve. The will is valid, and I'm the rightful heir. That remains to be seen. We have evidence that you exerted undue influence over your grandmother, taking advantage of her declining mental faculties to secure an inheritance you didn't earn. That's a lie, and you know it, is it? We have witnesses who can testify about your frequent visits to Eleanor's home in recent months, your discussions about her will, your encouragement of her resentment toward your parents. What witnesses? That never happened. We also have medical evidence suggesting Eleanor was suffering from early-stage dementia, which would call into question her competence to make major changes to her will. I felt a chill run through me. They were really doing this. They were going to court with fabricated evidence and false testimony, gambling that they could convince a judge that I'd manipulated a mentally incompetent woman. If you take this to court, you're going to lose, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Maybe. But even if we lose, the legal process will tie up the estate for years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in fees. Is that really what you want? What do you want? A reasonable settlement. Your parents aren't greedy people, Jessica. They don't expect to inherit the full estate. But they do believe they're entitled to a fair share of Eleanor's wealth, given that she was your father's mother. How much is a fair share? 50%. $15 million. You keep $15 million, they get $15 million, and we all move on with our lives. I almost laughed at the audacity. They were demanding half of my inheritance as the price for not dragging me through a fraudulent legal challenge. And if I refuse, then we go to court, and you risk losing everything. Inheritance challenges are unpredictable, Jessica. Even if you think you have a strong case, juries can be swayed by emotional testimony about family loyalty and parental rights. I need time to think about it. You have 24 hours. After that, we file the challenge and the settlement offer expires. He hung up before I could respond, leaving me sitting in my apartment with my head spinning. In the span of 2 days, I'd gone from discovering an unexpected inheritance to facing extortion from my own parents. They were willing to commit perjury, manufacture evidence, and destroy our family relationship for money they had no legal right to claim. The worst part was that their threat might actually work. Even if I ultimately won in court, the emotional and financial cost of fighting them could be devastating. And there was always the possibility that their lies might be convincing enough to sway a judge or jury. I needed to call Patricia Hernandez's office and see if she could meet with me tonight instead of waiting until morning. This situation was escalating rapidly, and I needed professional advice before making any decisions about how to respond to my parents' ultimatum. As I reached for my phone, it rang again. This time it was Mom, and her voice was different than I'd ever heard it before. Cold, controlled, and utterly without warmth. Jessica, I hope you've had time to think about Mr. Kemp's offer. We're trying to be reasonable here, but our patience isn't unlimited. Mom, how can you do this? How can you lie in court about your own daughter? We're not lying about anything. We're simply making sure the truth comes out about what really happened between you and Eleanor. You know that's not the truth. The truth is that you manipulated a lonely old woman into giving you money that should have gone to family members who actually cared about her. I barely saw her. You made sure of that. We protected you from her manipulation, and this is how you repay us. By believing her lies and turning against your own parents." The conversation felt surreal. This woman who'd raised me, who'd supposedly loved me unconditionally, was now speaking to me like I was an enemy who'd betrayed her trust. "I never turned against you. You turned against me the moment you decided I didn't deserve to make my own choices about money that was left to me." "Deserve?" Mom's voice rose. "You think you deserve $30 million for doing nothing while your parents worked their whole lives to build a future for this family? You mean while you worked to build wealth that you hid from me, while making me feel guilty about every aspiration that cost money?" There was a long silence. When Mom spoke again, her voice was quiet but venomous. "You have 24 hours, Jessica. Take the settlement or we'll see you in court. And when we're done, you'll be lucky to walk away with anything at all." She hung up, leaving me staring at my phone in shock. The loving, supportive mother I'd known my entire life had just threatened to destroy me in court if I didn't give her half of my inheritance. I realized then that Eleanor had been right about everything. My parents had never seen me as an independent person with my own rights and dreams. I was property to them, an investment that was supposed to pay dividends in the form of gratitude and obedience. The inheritance had disrupted their return on that investment, and now they were willing to do whatever it took to restore their control. But I was no longer the dependent daughter who'd accepted their version of reality without question. I had resources now, and I had the truth on my side. If they wanted a fight, I was going to give them one they'd never forget. I spent the entire night awake, pacing my apartment and thinking about the impossible choice my parents had given me. By dawn, I'd made my decision. I wasn't going to be extorted by people who'd spent my entire life manipulating me, no matter what the consequences might be. Patricia Hernandez agreed to see me at 7 a.m. before her regular office hours. Her law firm occupied the top floor of a downtown Phoenix high-rise, and her corner office had floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. She was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair, and the kind of confident bearing that comes from decades of winning difficult cases. "I've reviewed the materials Mr. Morrison sent over," she said after I'd explained the ultimatum. "Your parents are playing a very dangerous game. Perjury is a felony, and suborning perjury is even worse. If we can prove they're manufacturing evidence, they could face serious criminal charges. But what if we can't prove it? What if their lies are convincing enough? Then we fight them with the truth." Eleanor left an extensive paper trail documenting her mental competence and her reasons for disinheriting your parents. "We have medical records, financial records, correspondence with multiple attorneys over the years, and detailed documentation of your parents' deception." Patricia spread several documents across her conference table. "Look at this. Eleanor had a complete neurological evaluation just 6 months ago, specifically because she wanted to preempt any claims about mental incompetence. The results show absolutely no signs of cognitive decline. She showed me test results, brain scans, and a detailed report from a neurologist stating that Eleanor's mental faculties were completely normal for someone her age. She also had her attorney meetings recorded," Patricia continued. "With her permission, of course. We have hours of video showing her discussing her will changes, explaining her reasoning, and demonstrating complete mental clarity." "She recorded the meetings?" Eleanor was a very thorough woman who anticipated exactly this scenario. She knew your parents well enough to predict they'd try to challenge her will, and she prepared accordingly. Patricia pulled out another file. "She also documented every instance of your parents refusing her offers to help you. Phone records, email correspondence, even recordings of some conversations where they explicitly told her you weren't interested in her assistance." I stared at the evidence spread across the table. Eleanor hadn't just left me an inheritance. She'd left me a complete defense against the family members who would try to steal it. "There's one more thing," Patricia said, her expression growing serious. "Eleanor left a sealed letter to be opened only if your parents contested the will. Mr. Morrison brought it over this morning." She handed me an envelope marked with Eleanor's careful handwriting, "To be P. Opened only in the event of legal challenge by Richard and Margaret Winters." Inside was a letter that made my blood run cold. "If you're reading this," it began, "then Richard and Margaret have chosen the path I hoped they would avoid. What I'm about to reveal will be painful, but you need to know the full truth about the people who raised you. The letter went on to explain that Eleanor had hired investigators not just to verify my parents' financial situation, but to uncover the extent of their deception. What they'd found went far beyond hidden wealth. Your parents have been stealing from you for years, the letter continued. When your grandfather died, he left a trust fund for your education, managed by your parents as trustees. Instead of using it for your schooling, they transferred the money to their own accounts and told you the trust didn't exist. I felt dizzy reading this. How much money? The letter answered my question. The trust originally contained $200,000, specifically designated for your college expenses and graduate education. By the time you graduated, it should have grown to nearly $300,000 with interest. $300,000 that should have paid for my education, eliminating the student loan debt I was still carrying, and allowing me to pursue graduate school without financial stress. Money that had been stolen by my own parents while they watched me struggle to pay for basic necessities. There's more, the letter continued. I also discovered that they've been intercepting mail addressed to you, including acceptance letters to programs you never knew you'd been admitted to, scholarship offers you never received, and even job opportunities that were sent directly to your home address. The room seemed to spin around me. How many opportunities had I missed because my parents had literally stolen my mail? How many scholarships, internships, or job offers had I never even known about? Patricia was watching my face carefully. Are you all right? You look pale. They stole my college fund. They stole my mail. They've been sabotaging my life for years. I'm afraid there's more. Eleanor also discovered that they've been using your social security number to open credit accounts and take out loans, then paying them off to avoid damaging your credit. Technically, that's identity theft. I thought about all the times I'd checked my credit report and been confused by accounts I didn't remember opening. My parents had always explained them as mistakes by credit reporting agencies, clerical errors that happened to people with common names. I'd believed them because I trusted them completely. The final piece, Patricia said gently, is that Eleanor left instructions for all of this evidence to be turned over to law enforcement if your parents tried to contest the will through fraudulent means. She's basically giving me the option to have them arrested. She's giving you the option to defend yourself with the full truth. If they want to fight you in court with lies and manufactured evidence, you can respond with documented proof of their criminal behavior. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what Eleanor had uncovered and documented. My parents weren't just greedy relatives trying to steal an inheritance. They were criminals who'd been systematically defrauding their own daughter for years. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Dad. Time's up. We're filing the challenge this morning unless you accept our offer. I showed the message to Patricia, who smiled grimly. Perfect timing. I'll draft a response that should make them reconsider their position. What kind of response? A detailed summary of the evidence we have against them, including the criminal activities Eleanor documented. We'll give them the same choice they gave you: back off voluntarily, or face the full legal consequences of their actions. Patricia spent the next hour drafting a letter that laid out everything Eleanor had discovered about my parents' fraudulent behavior: the trust fund theft, the identity theft, the mail interception, the hidden wealth, and the documented evidence supporting all of it. We'll offer them a deal, she explained. Drop the will challenge immediately, return the money they stole from your trust fund with interest, and agree to have no further contact with you. In exchange, we won't file criminal charges or pursue civil damages for the other fraudulent activities. And if they refuse, then we destroy them in court. Not only will they lose the will challenge, but they'll face criminal prosecution for multiple felonies and civil lawsuits that could bankrupt them. The letter was delivered to Douglas Kemp's office by messenger at exactly 10 a.m., 1 hour before the deadline they'd given me. Patricia and I waited in her office for their response, which came faster than either of us had expected. At 11:30, Kemp called Patricia directly. She put the call on speakerphone so I could hear both sides of the conversation. "This is outrageous," he began without preamble. You're threatening my clients with criminal prosecution based on wild allegations from a dead woman. The allegations are thoroughly documented with physical evidence, Patricia replied calmly. Bank records, audio recordings, copies of intercepted mail, credit reports showing fraudulent accounts. Would you like me to fax over the highlights? My clients deny any wrongdoing. They were simply managing their daughter's finances and protecting her from bad decisions. Managing finances they never told her existed? Opening credit accounts without her knowledge? Stealing mail addressed to her? Which part of that sounds like parental protection? There was a long pause. What exactly are you proposing? Patricia outlined our terms clearly. Drop the will challenge, return the stolen trust fund money, sign a no-contact agreement, and walk away. In exchange, we wouldn't pursue criminal charges. That's extortion, Kemp said. No, that's a settlement offer. Extortion would be if we demanded money they were entitled to. We're simply offering to let them avoid the consequences of their own criminal behavior in exchange for leaving Jessica alone. I need to discuss this with my clients. You have 2 hours. After that, the offer expires, and we proceed with both the criminal referrals and the civil lawsuits. Patricia hung up and turned to me. How do you feel about potentially sending your parents to prison? I thought about the question seriously. These people had shaped my entire life through lies and manipulation. They'd stolen money that was meant for my education, sabotaged opportunities I'd never even known about, and now they were trying to extort half of my inheritance through perjured testimony. I feel like they made their choice, I said finally. They chose money over their relationship with me. Now they can face the consequences. Are you prepared for the possibility that they'll fight this? That they'll try to claim you're being vindictive? Or that Eleanor poisoned your mind against them? Let them try. Everything Eleanor documented can be independently verified. Bank records don't lie. Audio recordings don't lie. Credit reports don't lie. At 1:15, Kemp called back. His tone was noticeably different, less aggressive and more conciliatory. My clients are prepared to consider your settlement terms, but they have some concerns about the no-contact provision. What concerns? They're worried about being completely cut off from their daughter. They're willing to return the trust fund money and drop the will challenge, but they'd like to maintain some possibility of future reconciliation. Patricia looked at me. The decision was mine to make. Tell them the no-contact provision is non-negotiable, I said. They forfeited their right to a relationship with me when they decided to steal from me and lie to me for my entire adult life. You heard her, Patricia told Kemp. Those are our terms. Take them or leave them. I'll need to discuss this with my clients again. You have 30 minutes. The call that came back 28 minutes later was brief. My clients accept your terms, Kemp said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Within the hour, we had signed agreements dropping the will challenge, returning the stolen trust fund money with interest, and establishing a permanent no-contact order. My parents also signed affidavits admitting to the financial fraud, which would serve as evidence if they ever violated the agreement. As I sat in Patricia's office reviewing the final documents, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. I'd won a complete victory, but the cost was the relationship with the people who'd raised me. Even though that relationship had been built on lies and manipulation, it was still the only family I'd ever known. How do you feel? Patricia asked as we finished signing the paperwork. Free, I said, and realized I meant it. For the first time in my life, I feel completely free to make my own choices. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in the office of a private wealth management firm, reviewing investment strategies for my inheritance. I decided to use part of the money to start a nonprofit foundation focused on helping young adults from controlling families gain financial independence and educational opportunities. Eleanor's final letter had included one more surprise: detailed records of other young people she'd quietly helped over the years, providing scholarships and support to those whose families had tried to limit their potential. She'd wanted me to continue that work, using the resources she'd left me to help others break free from the same kind of manipulation I'd experienced. I'd also enrolled in the graduate program at Northwestern, finally pursuing the master's degree in environmental law that I'd given up years earlier. The partial scholarship was still available, and now I could afford the living expenses that had once seemed impossible. My parents made one attempt to contact me directly, showing up at my apartment building despite the no-contact order. But I'd moved to a secure building with a doorman, and they were turned away before they could reach my floor. Patricia sent them a reminder about the legal consequences of violating our agreement, and I never heard from them again. The strangest part of my new life was how many opportunities suddenly appeared once I was free to pursue them without considering my parents' approval or supposed financial limitations. I received offers for internships, speaking engagements, and consulting work that would have been impossible to accept when I was living paycheck to paycheck and believing I needed to stay in safe, predictable employment. 6 months after the will reading, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a photocopy of a cashier's check made out to me for $30 million. Someone had written fake across it in red marker, along with a note, "Just like your love for your family." I stared at the package for a moment, then threw it in the trash. They still didn't understand that this had never been about the money. It had been about the lies, the manipulation, and the theft of my autonomy. Eleanor's inheritance had simply given me the resources to break free from their control and build the life I'd always wanted. As I sat in my new apartment, looking out at the city lights and planning my foundation's first scholarship program, I thought about Eleanor's final gift. It wasn't just the money, though that had certainly changed everything. It was the truth about my family, the documentation of their crimes, and most importantly, the knowledge that I deserved better than a life built on their lies. The check they'd burned at the will reading had been real, but it represented only a fraction of what Eleanor had actually left me. The real inheritance was my freedom, and that was something no one could ever steal or burn or contest in court. I'd finally learned what Eleanor had tried to teach me through her actions. That love without respect is manipulation, that family without honesty is performance, and that the most valuable inheritance anyone can receive is the courage to live their own life on their own terms. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.